The Comanche warrior's painted face froze as the children's words cut through desert wind, like arrows finding their mark. He had ridden 3 days to claim scalps, to honor his fallen brother, to paint his horse with enemy blood. But these small voices speaking broken words in his tongue made his war lance tremble. The Chinese children stood between him and their dying mother's wagon, their black eyes reflecting the same terror he had seen in his own sister's face when the bluecoats came. Something ancient and unnamed stirred in his chest, a recognition that transcended the painted lines of war. The spirits had sent him here not for vengeance, but for something his warrior's heart had forgotten. The morning sun carved shadows across the alkali flats where the broken wagon sat like a wounded bird, its canvas torn and flapping in the relentless wind. Tall Bear had tracked the settlers for 2 days, his pinto's hooves finding their trail through sage and stone with the patience his grandfather had taught him. The war paint on his cheeks felt heavy now, mixed with dust and the salt of his own sweat, each red and black line a promise to his brother's spirit that blood would answer blood. He had expected to find men with rifles, women with fear-bright eyes, the usual tableau of invasion that had played across these lands since the first wagon wheels scarred the earth. Instead, he found children. The boy could not have seen more than 12 summers, his sister perhaps 8, both of them standing guard over something precious and dying in the wagon's shade. Their clothes were strange, silk that caught the light like water, colors that spoke of distant mountains and rivers he had never seen. But their stance was universal, the way all young things position themselves between predator and nest, between the world's cruelty and what they love most. Tall Bear's war horse stamped and snorted, sensing the tension in his rider's body, the way the warrior's grip had loosened on his lance. The children did not run, though their small bodies trembled like leaves before storm. "We cannot run," the boy said again, his words careful and strange in the Comanche tongue, learned perhaps from traders or captives. "Our mother is dying." The girl beside him said nothing, but her hand found her brother's, their fingers intertwining like roots seeking strength in shared earth. Tall Bear felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like ice breaking on the river in spring. He had come here to take scalps, to honor the war trail, to feed his grief with the blood of those who had brought the sickness and the soldiers to his people. But these children spoke of a dying mother, and suddenly his own mother's face rose before him, the way she had looked when the fever took her, the way she had whispered his name like a prayer. The wagon creaked in the wind, and from within came the sound that Tall Bear recognized without needing to see, the rattling breath of someone walking the spirit trail. He had heard it too many times in too many lodges, as his people fell to diseases that came with the white man's progress. The irony cut deep. Here were more strangers, more carriers of change and loss, yet their grief wore the same face as his own. The boy's eyes never left Tall Bear's face, reading the war paint like a map of intentions, understanding perhaps that his words had found their mark in some unexpected place within the warrior's heart. Tall Bear's lance point dropped toward the earth, not in surrender but in something more complex, a recognition that this moment had become something other than what he had planned. The spirits moved in mysterious ways, his grandmother had always said, weaving patterns too large for human eyes to see. Perhaps this was such a pattern, this meeting of enemies who shared the same sorrow, the same helpless watch over death's approach. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust and something else, the sweet, sick smell of fever that he knew too well. The silence stretched between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross, built from the boy's desperate courage and the warrior's sudden uncertainty. Tall Bear felt the weight of his brother's death pressing against his ribs, the promise he had made to the war trail, the expectations of his band, waiting for him to return with proof of vengeance taken. But he also felt something else, something that made his painted face feel like a mask he could no longer wear. In the children's eyes, he saw not enemies but mirrors, reflecting a grief that knew no boundaries of blood or tribe. Tall Bear dismounted slowly, his moccasins touching earth that suddenly felt sacred in ways he had not expected. The children stepped closer together but did not retreat, their small bodies forming a wall of determination that reminded him of his own sister when she had tried to protect their mother's medicine bundle from the soldiers. The wagon's interior was dim, but he could see the shape of a woman lying still beneath blankets, her breathing shallow and labored. She was young, perhaps no older than his own 25 winters, her black hair spread across a makeshift pillow like spilled ink. The fever had carved hollows in her cheeks, but even in sickness, her face held a dignity that made him think of his grandmother's stories about the first mothers, the ones who had walked with spirits. "She has been sick for many days," the boy whispered, switching to broken English, as if hoping the language might carry more weight with this painted stranger. "We try to make her well, but—" His voice broke like a stick underfoot, and his sister began to cry silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her small face. Tall Bear found himself stepping closer to the wagon, drawn by something he could not name. The woman's eyes opened then, dark and fever-bright, and when they found his face she did not scream. Instead, she smiled, a small, sad expression that spoke of acceptance and gratitude that her children were not alone. The warrior's hand moved without his permission to the medicine pouch at his belt, fingers finding the sacred herbs his grandmother had taught him to gather. Willow bark for fever, sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for calling helpful spirits. He'd carried these things for his own people's healing, never imagining he would offer them to strangers, to enemies. But as he looked at the dying woman and her brave children, the words enemy and stranger began to lose their meaning, becoming sounds without substance, like wind through empty lodges. The boy watched his movements with desperate hope, understanding perhaps that this painted warrior carried more than weapons. "Your mother," Tall Bear said carefully, his English rough but clear. "She is far from her people." It was not a question but a recognition, one exile acknowledging another. The boy nodded, fresh tears starting. "We come from California. Papa died in the mountains. Mama, she gets sick after. We tried to reach the fort, but—" He gestured helplessly at the broken wagon wheel, the scattered supplies, the impossible distance that stretched in every direction. Tall Bear understood. He had seen this story before, written in abandoned wagons and unmarked graves across the territory. The land took what it wanted, regardless of the color of skin or the shape of prayers. The woman in the wagon stirred, her hand reaching weakly toward her children. The girl immediately grasped those pale fingers, holding them against her cheek like a talisman against loss. Tall Bear watched this gesture and felt his own mother's hand in memory, the way she had touched his face the last time, blessing him with fingers that already felt like smoke. The war paint on his cheeks suddenly felt like a lie, a costume worn for a play that no longer made sense. He had come here to take life, to balance the scales of grief with more grief. Instead, he found himself wanting to preserve it, to stand guard against death the way these children stood guard against him. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the understanding that choices made in this moment would echo far beyond this broken wagon, this dying woman, these frightened children. Tall Bear felt the weight of his brother's spirit, the expectations of his war band, the ancient codes that had shaped his life since boyhood. But he also felt something newer, something that spoke in the voice of the woman's labored breathing and the children's quiet courage. The spirits had brought him here for a reason, but perhaps not the reason he had thought. Perhaps some promises were meant to be broken so that others, more sacred, could be kept. The warrior's horse shifted beneath him, sensing the change in its rider's spirit. Thunderhawk dismounted slowly, his moccasins touching the dusty earth with the reverence of one entering sacred ground. The children watched him with eyes that held no fear, only the desperate hope of those who had nowhere left to turn. Their mother's labored breathing filled the silence between heartbeats, each exhale a prayer whispered to an indifferent sky. The warrior approached the makeshift shelter, his war paint catching the dying light like ancient symbols carved into canyon walls. He had killed men for less than what these strangers represented: invasion, weakness, the dilution of his people's sacred lands. Yet something in the smallest child's tear-streaked face reminded him of his own sister, taken by fever 3 winters past. The eldest boy, no more than 12 summers, stepped forward with trembling courage. His words came in broken English, learned perhaps from traders or missionaries who had passed through their distant homeland. "Please, sir, she cannot travel. The fever burns too hot." Thunderhawk studied the boy's face, seeing in it the same fierce protectiveness he had worn when defending his own family from cavalry raids. The irony cut deep. Here stood a child of the very people who had driven the Comanche from their ancestral hunting grounds. Yet this boy's love for his mother burned with the same sacred fire that had always guided Thunderhawk's own heart. The warrior's hand moved instinctively to the medicine pouch at his belt, feeling the dried herbs his grandmother had gathered under the full moon. Even enemies could share the same wounds. Inside the crude shelter, the woman lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her skin bore the pallor of approaching death, yet her features held a dignity that spoke of inner strength, worn thin by impossible circumstances. Thunderhawk knelt beside her, his calloused fingers touching her burning forehead with surprising gentleness. The children gathered around him like moths drawn to flame, their small bodies radiating the desperate energy of those who refused to surrender hope. He had seen this fever before. It had claimed warriors and children alike in his own village, leaving behind only memories and the bitter taste of helplessness. But his grandmother's medicine had sometimes worked miracles, pulling souls back from the edge of the spirit world when conventional healing had failed. The warrior began to speak in his native tongue, his voice carrying the rhythm of ancient prayers. The children did not understand his words, but they felt the power behind them, the same power that had sustained his people through countless seasons of hardship and loss. He mixed the sacred herbs with water from his own pouch, creating a paste that smelled of sage and distant mountains. As he worked, the youngest child, a girl no more than 6, reached out and touched his arm with fingers soft as butterfly wings. The gesture broke something inside him, some carefully constructed wall between duty and compassion. In her touch, he felt the universal language of need, the same desperate love that had driven him to raid enemy camps to feed his own starving people. The medicine went onto the woman's lips drop by precious drop, each one carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations. Thunderhawk's hands moved with practiced precision, applying cooling cloths to her fevered skin while murmuring prayers that had been old when his grandfather's grandfather walked the earth. The children watched in silence, their faith placing itself entirely in the hands of this painted stranger who had appeared like an answer to their unspoken prayers. Outside, the desert wind began to sing through the canyon walls, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of cooler air. The warrior felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a ceremonial robe, heavy with responsibility, but somehow right. Sometimes the greatest victories were won not with weapons, but with the simple act of choosing mercy over vengeance. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the woman's breathing began to change. The harsh, labored gasps softened into something deeper, more natural, as if her spirit had decided to fight rather than surrender. Thunderhawk continued his vigil, applying fresh herbs and speaking words of healing that seemed to flow from some source beyond his conscious mind. The children pressed closer, their small hands joining his, in the ancient ritual of willing life back into a failing body. In that moment, beneath the vast canopy of desert stars, the boundaries between Comanche and Chinese, warrior and child, enemy and friend, dissolved into something more fundamental: the shared recognition of love's power to transcend all other loyalties. The fever would break, or it would not, but the choice to try had already changed them all forever. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold that seemed to whisper of new possibilities. Thunderhawk, had not slept, his vigil maintained through the long hours when death walks closest to the living. The woman's fever had raged through the night like a wildfire, consuming her strength even as the warrior's medicine worked its ancient magic within her blood. The children had dozed fitfully against his broad shoulders, their small bodies seeking the comfort of his steady presence. Now, as the first light touched the makeshift shelter, he felt a subtle change in the air, the same shift that came before summer storms, when the very atmosphere seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The woman's skin felt cooler beneath his weathered palm, and her breathing had found a rhythm that spoke of healing rather than surrender. The eldest boy stirred first, his eyes opening to find the warrior still keeping watch over their mother. Gratitude flooded the child's face, followed quickly by a hope so fragile it seemed it might shatter at the slightest touch. Thunderhawk nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of mountains, and the boy understood that the crisis had passed. The other children awakened one by one, their small faces turning toward their mother with the desperate hunger of those who had prepared themselves for loss. When they saw her peaceful expression, heard the steady rhythm of her breathing, their joy erupted in whispered exclamations and tears of relief. The warrior watched their reunion with eyes that had seen too much sorrow, feeling something long frozen begin to thaw within his chest. Perhaps the spirits had not abandoned him after all, but had simply been waiting for him to remember that strength could be measured in gentleness as well as violence. The woman's eyes fluttered open as the sun climbed higher, her gaze unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as consciousness returned. She saw her children gathered around her, their faces bright with tears of joy, and then her eyes found the painted warrior who knelt beside her bed of blankets. Fear flickered across her features for just a moment, the instinctive response of one who had heard too many stories of Comanche raids and frontier violence. But then she saw the medicine pouch in his hands, smelled the healing herbs that had drawn her back from the edge of death, and understanding dawned like sunrise over the mountains. Her lips moved in words too soft to hear, but Thunderhawk read the gratitude in her eyes and felt it settle into his bones like warmth from a winter fire. The children clustered around their mother, their small hands touching her face and arms, as if to convince themselves that she was truly alive and healing. The youngest girl looked up at Thunderhawk with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years, and spoke a single word in her native tongue, a word that needed no translation because it carried the universal music of thankfulness. The warrior felt that word lodge itself in his heart like an arrow, but this wound brought healing rather than pain. He had spent so many years defining himself by what he could destroy, by the fear he could inspire in his enemies, that he had forgotten the deeper satisfaction that came from preserving life rather than taking it. In saving this woman, he had perhaps saved something essential within himself, some part of his spirit that had been slowly dying beneath the weight of endless warfare. As the morning progressed, the woman grew stronger, able to sit up and take small sips of water flavored with healing herbs. Her children hovered around her like protective spirits, their earlier despair transformed into fierce joy. Thunderhawk prepared to leave, knowing that his presence would soon become a danger to them all. Other warriors might come looking for him, or settlers might arrive who would not understand the mercy he had shown. But as he gathered his belongings, the eldest boy approached him with something clutched in his small fist. It was a jade pendant, carved in the shape of a dragon, worn smooth by generations of handling. The child pressed it into the warrior's palm with words that came haltingly but with unmistakable sincerity. For saving her, for saving us all. Thunderhawk looked down at the small treasure, feeling its weight as something far greater than mere stone. It was a bridge between worlds, a token of trust that transcended the boundaries of blood and nation. The warrior mounted his horse as the sun reached its zenith, the jade pendant now hanging beside his own medicine pouch. The woman raised her hand in farewell, her strength returning with each passing hour, while her children waved with the enthusiasm of those who had witnessed a miracle. Thunderhawk turned his horse toward the distant mountains, but something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The rigid set of his shoulders had softened, and his eyes held a light that had been absent for too many seasons. Behind him, the small family began to pack their meager belongings, preparing to continue their journey with renewed hope. The desert wind carried their voices to him as he rode away, speaking words of gratitude in a language he did not understand but felt in his bones. Some victories, he realized, were measured not in enemies defeated but in lives preserved, in the choice to build rather than destroy, in the courage to let mercy triumph over the easier path of vengeance. The journey back to his village stretched before Thunderhawk, like a meditation written in stone and sky. Each mile carried him further from the moment that had changed everything, yet closer to a reckoning with his own people that would test the depth of his transformation. The jade pendant swayed gently against his chest with each step of his horse, a constant reminder of the choice he had made and the price he might yet pay for it. His war party would be expecting him to return with scalps and stories of vengeance, not tales of mercy shown to the very people they had sworn to drive from their lands. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but Thunderhawk felt a coolness within his spirit that had nothing to do with shade or wind. He had discovered that some forms of strength could only be found in the willingness to appear weak. Some victories only achieved through the courage to surrender the familiar comfort of hatred. The landscape around him seemed different now, as if his act of compassion had somehow altered his perception of the world itself. Where once he had seen only strategic positions and potential ambush sites, he now noticed the delicate beauty of desert flowers blooming in impossible places, the graceful flight of hawks riding the thermal currents, the way afternoon light transformed ordinary rocks into sculptures of gold and amber. His horse sensed the change in its rider, moving with a lighter step despite the long miles behind them. Thunderhawk found himself thinking not of the raids he had led or the enemies he had defeated, but of his grandmother's stories about the old days, when warriors were measured as much by their wisdom and mercy as by their skill in battle. Perhaps he was not abandoning his heritage, but returning to its deepest roots. As evening approached, he made camp in a sheltered canyon where ancient petroglyphs told stories older than memory. The painted figures seemed to watch him as he built his fire, their silent presence a reminder that countless generations had faced similar crossroads between vengeance and forgiveness. Thunderhawk pulled out the jade pendant, studying its intricate carving in the flickering firelight. The dragon's eyes seemed alive, holding secrets that transcended the boundaries between cultures. He thought of the Chinese woman's children, wondering if they had found safe passage to whatever destination called to them, if the youngest girl still remembered the painted warrior who had knelt beside her mother's sickbed. Their faces had become part of his own story now, woven into the fabric of his identity as surely as his war paint and tribal scars. The stars emerged one by one, filling the desert sky with their ancient light. Thunderhawk lay back against his saddle, feeling the weight of the jade pendant over his heart like a talisman of transformation. Tomorrow he would reach his village, would face the questions and perhaps the anger of his fellow warriors. Some would call him weak, a betrayer of their sacred cause. Others might understand that true strength sometimes required the courage to choose a harder path than revenge. He thought of the woman's fevered face, of her children's desperate love, of the moment when mercy had triumphed over the easier choice of violence. Whatever consequences awaited him, he knew he would make the same choice again, because some decisions changed not just the world around you, but the very core of who you were meant to become. The fire burned low as Thunderhawk drifted toward sleep, his dreams filled not with images of battle and conquest, but with visions of healing and hope. In his mind, He saw the Chinese family continuing their journey, the woman growing stronger with each passing day, her children's laughter echoing across the vast landscape like a promise of better times to come. He saw himself returning to his village, not as a failed warrior, but as a man who had discovered that the greatest victories were often invisible to those who measured success only in blood and territory. The jade pendant caught the last glimmers of firelight, its surface reflecting the stars above like a bridge between earth and sky. In choosing mercy over vengeance, he had perhaps found the path that would lead his people toward a future where strength and compassion could coexist, where the old ways could evolve without losing their essential spirit. The desert wind sang its ancient song through the canyon walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Thunderhawk closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, feeling for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices between the familiar comfort of hatred and the more difficult path of understanding. But tonight, beneath the vast canopy of stars, he was simply a man who had chosen to save a life rather than take one, and in that choice had discovered something precious that he had thought lost forever. The warrior's greatest weapon, he now understood, was not his skill with blade or bow, but his capacity to recognize the humanity in those he had been taught to see as enemies.